Hey, everybody. Very excited. I got an incredible end of the year interview episode for you. So, very excited to bring this to you. I'm going to be showing you my interview with John Shipton, Julian Assange's father. I spoke to him in person in a small theater at the very end of October, and this has not aired anywhere else. So this is the first time this has been seen, other than by the 100 people in that theater. So I'm very excited to bring this to you. The reason I was speaking to John Shipton, Assange's father, was because he has been on a kind of world tour promoting a movie that is intended to continue the fight for Assange's freedom, his son's freedom. And it's called Ithaca, and a father, a family, a fight for justice. It's mainly about John Shipton and obviously Julian Assange, but then Stella Morris, Julian Assange's wife, and what their life is like as they continue to fight for this justice. Shipton is a soft-spoken man. I've gotten to interview him a few times. A soft-spoken yet powerful interview. And he never sought out he never wanted to seek out to have any kind of fame or notoriety. But he and Stella Morris both realized over time, as the fight for their son and husband continued, that this is simply how the media works. The thing that would get the most attention to Assange's case and to the persecution against him and to the incredible, gut-wrenching, just revolting crime that is being done against Julian Assange, the best way to get attention was for them to speak out, was for them to do endless interviews and really, unfortunately, spend their lives, several years of their lives so far, doing nothing but giving interviews and trying to keep this in the public's view, because we know how our culture works. It is like, boom, boom, boom. What you done for me lately? What is the latest new shocking thing that has happened? And they've got to keep Assange in the, granted, he's not going to be talked about by the mainstream media, but at least in the independent media's mind. And the only way to do that is to do things like put out this film. This film, I believe, has only been shown in person. So unless you've been to a screening, I don't think you've seen it. Now, that is not going to matter in the interview you're about to see with John Shipton. In fact, the entire audience there was watching the film after we spoke. So the audience in the live event also had not seen the film yet. So don't worry. There won't be moments where I reference things and you're like, I don't know what's happening. We're not... It's not a Lord of the Rings film, and we're giving away the secrets. But so for the first half of this episode, I'm going to show that interview with me and Julian Assange's father. The second half, which has never been seen before, the second half, I'm going to speak to a great journalist, Kevin Gosztola, who has just really been on the Assange beat. He has really been at every moment that this has happened. He's been in the court at times, reporting on Assange, and often he's been live streaming what's going on in the court, because he's been in the court virtually, but so he's live streaming at like 4 a.m. American time. Really devoted, impressively devoted to revealing this, again, horrific injustice against Julian Assange. And so I will be speaking with Kevin Gosztola live right after this interview airs, and I hope you enjoy all of it. I hope you get a lot out of it. And like I said, John Shipton is he's soft spoken, and I wanted to give him and Assange, him and Julian, the proper respect for what they're facing. And so in this event, you'll see I'm not bringing the humor or the funny or the silly ups and downs of my voice. I pretty much just keep it very serious, but I think you'll find this interview powerful, because John Shipton is powerful as he speaks about his son. So we're going to get to that right now. This was 2 months ago, live in Stockholm, Sweden. It's in English though. It has never been seen before. So this is the first time. You guys are the first, and I really hope you enjoy it. Again, I'll be back after the interview to speak with Kevin Gastola about all of the updates about Julian Assange and things that are not in this interview with his father. So, I hope the volume is good enough. It's pretty good. It doesn't the audio is not Hollywood level, but it's pretty good. So I hope you enjoy. Of course, sarcasm. As you say in the film, you shied away from the media, but this film it focuses on the family that surrounds this whole pursuit to achieve Julian's freedom. Stella Morris, his wife, his father, Gabriel. Sorry, guys, working on fixing it. 1 second. Huh. Really hope this works. All right. Tell me again if the sound's not working. Today, and it's a moving and powerful film. I know you've always sought to be a movie star yourself. No, that's of course sarcasm. As you say in the film, you shied away from the media. But this film it focuses on the family that surrounds this whole pursuit to achieve Julian's freedom. Stella Morris, his wife, his father, Gabriel's brother. Can you just talk a bit about why the film focuses on that angle, that aspect?
Thank you for your welcome. I'd just like to say Lee and I are two, well, I'm an aging warrior, he's a young warrior. We meet each other on the circuit once in DC, I think, or twice in DC, in the District of Columbia, the capital of the United States. So, thanks. I think, giving the depth, the struggle, the fight to bring about justice for Julian, as a consequence of that justice for all of us, is central to the film. So, and the emotions that go into it, like I worked in the building industry, and all of a sudden, the most people I've ever spoken to is like a couple of builders, and all of a sudden you're speaking to people all around the world, and the inner conflict and torment and determination that rules you. This film shows quite well. I have nothing to do with the film, by the way. I just go about the work that's given to me each day, and the camera follows you around. Even to the extent that, while you're having breakfast, the camera's looking over your shoulder. I just take no notice. You might see in the film, occasionally I get what you might say is a little bit impatient. But that's only because, not of the filmmaker being persistent. It's because each day, after 12 hours on the road, and after having to say something new 4 or 5 times a day, keep it fresh, keep it raw, keep it immediate, at the end of the day, you're a bit worn out. So, you're probably, even you're probably just a bit short with people. So forgive me for that anyway.
I think we can all understand that. You say in the film, the desire for a narrative around Julian is stronger than the desire to understand the person you're speaking to. Can you talk more about that?
So the technique seems to be these days that to embrace us in a narrative, and a convincing narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then all of the institutions of government and their propaganda arms use that narrative, and as a consequence, we're taken along within a narrative, rather like a river. Now, I object to that. It doesn't feel like that. It's this sitting here in front of you, people who I haven't met before for the most part. It doesn't feel like part of a narrative. It feels like a distinct, unique, emotional and important event. So I just reject the idea of a narrative, and I reject it in the case of Julian Assange, who, if submerged into a narrative, the phenomenon of Julian, a unique human being, as we all are, the phenomenon of Julian submerged into a narrative becomes ordinary, and it excuses the institutions of state, the newspapers, the media generally, judges, lawyers. It excuses them because they say, well, we're in a narrative, but it's a distinct, unique event, the persecution of an individual who merely and simply published truth so that you could read it and I could read it and come to a conclusion which benefits ourselves in our daily lives, our families, and our communities. I think that's unique rather than fitting into an unfolding narrative where you get to an end and then you go back and have a sleep,
You speak about Julian printing, publishing truth. And to me, that's one of the most important notes of this whole story, which a lot of people, I feel it needs repeating, it bears repeating, because a lot of people still, because of the propaganda around it, don't know this. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange never printed a single thing that wasn't factual and absolutely accurate. And you compare that to every single other media organization, and they can't hold a candle to what WikiLeaks has done. And yet Julian Assange is the one in prison. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I just, in this, in this story, there's lots to feel a bit depressed about, governments hounding a person, locking them up 13 years now. If all of the governments involved, the United Kingdom, Sweden, United States, had obeyed their own laws, Julian would be here talking to you and saying thanks. Just obeyed their own laws, that's all. So this is a sort of like a burden on us that our institutions of state and governance don't work properly. So it becomes a burden and we protest against it vigorously. So to balance out that, there are 250,000 cables, 400,000 items in the Iraq war logs and 90,000 in the Afghan war files. So in the 400,000 of the Iraq war, it describes how 26 of the 28 water purification plants were destroyed, meaning that mums couldn't give their kids a glass of clean water without the fear that the child would get dysentery and shit themselves to death. That's every minute occurrence. Equally, the use of DU in the war in Iraq, that is documented.
Depleted uranium.
What does that mean, DU, depleted uranium? It means that a mother with child is in a permanent anxiety that she will give birth to a monster. They did that to that society, deliberately, calculatedly. It's documented. So that's to balance the ledger a little bit. In 2008, this is in the cables. In 2008, a group of American soldiers or United States soldiers went into a house just outside Baghdad and murdered all of the occupants. The mum and the dad and the children and uncles, aunties, babies, all of it. Fearful that they'd get into trouble for this heinous crime, they called in an airstrike and destroyed the house and all of the remnants of that little family, gone from the earth forever. That cable of that event went from the ambassador to the United States ambassador to Iraq, to the Department of State. It's one of the cables in the 250,000. It was read by the Iraqi parliamentarians and the Iraqi people. Somehow that ruined nation gathered the courage to say to the United States, we are not signing the Status of Forces Agreement. This means that the United States and its allies had to remove their forces from Iraq, which they did. That is, a leak brought an end to a war that balanced the ledger for us. These publications, that's one of 250,000. There is example after example of justice being brought by these revelations that were published in WikiLeaks. And as the evening goes on, I'll give you another example if you will indulge me. So, but it's really important to see that these crimes are reported, and as a consequence of their reportage, the work that men like Lee Camp do and others here sitting with us, those crimes allow us, the reportage allows us to force justice, which was done in the case of the example I gave.
And for a moment, when the Iraq war logs came out and et cetera, the mainstream media, at least some of them, did their job and worked with Julian to report these stories. And then they switched when it became clear that the empire, the US empire, the UK empire were working to crush Julian, and then the mainstream media has been very nearly silent, close to it about Julian's case. And speaking of that, I didn't know the number, the 26 out of 28 water purification plants, but that is not surprising to me because the latest numbers on how many have died in the US wars on terror is 6 million. 6 million people have died. That's 1 million directly, but 5 million from the destruction of infrastructure, et cetera, like those water filtration plants. So moving on to something else from the film, Stella Morris, Julian's wife, says that, and she says in the film that extradition cases where, we're all fighting to make sure Julian does not get extradited to the United States, where he will be essentially tortured for the rest of his life. There's no chance of a fair trial. She says that extradition cases are 99% environment and political climate and 1% law. Can you talk a little more about that? Because I think to a lot of people that would be shocking.
Thanks, Lee. But just do it in a roundabout way so that it becomes, has some magic in it. After the war, 1945, the people of the world got together. In particular, Sweden was foremost under the Prime Minister I've forgotten his name, prior to Olof Palme. In particular, Sweden was in the forefront. Formation of the United Nations, wherein nations could communicate with each other to forward their interests within laws. Fabulous. The greatest civil artifact ever brought into being by human beings. The United Nations. 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt and a man named Herbert Bear Everett, first president of the United Nations, an Australian, set about bringing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into being, which they did. That is, covering our rights, non-derogable rights, can't be lowered. A great civil artifact. 1958, the Conventions of Asylum ratified under Australia's authorship in the United Nations General Assembly, 1973-74 Christmas. The Conventions of Asylum. That is, we understand that states sometimes get over anxious about their security, and as a consequence of that, force themselves on people, making refugees, if you like, or dissidents, if you want to use another word. And those dissidents, we understand that states get anxious, and those dissidents can find asylum in missions. In 1973, 10,000 Chileans were in missions, in embassies in Santiago under the oppression of Pinochet. So we understand these things about ourselves and we bring in institutions. Okay. The laws, the rules of procedure, due process, they call it, where each side has to be equally armed, the defendant and the accused, came about 800 years ago at Rummingmead. Is due process. All of those wonderful artifacts have been abandoned in the case of Julian Assange by their very authors. Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States, the authors of these magnificent civil artifacts that grade, that allow us to relate to each other through laws, were abandoned. And one example of that is the communications between the United Kingdom Crown Prosecuting Service and the Swedish Prosecuting Authority. In 2013, the Swedish Prosecuting Authority wrote and said to the United Kingdom's Crown Prosecuting Service and said, we're a bit worried about this, and the solicitor for the Crown Prosecuting Service writes back and says, "You're not getting cold feet, are you? There's more to this than a simple extradition." Now that's documented. It's in an FOI release from your Swedish Prosecuting Authority, that they conspired to ruin due process. That is,
ruin their own reputation, bring themselves down from the very heights that they had achieved under Olof Palme and the Premier before him. So that's the circumstance. If any of those regulations, laws had been obeyed, Julian would be here with Lee chatting about, releases and so on. Really important to remember that the magnificence that this society and other authors in the West created, they abandoned for what? What did they get? A rotten reputation through the world that their legal system can wander off the track at the behest of the United States and the United Kingdom. That was their reward.
And, we've seen through this whole extradition trial what a circus it's been, how ridiculous many of the legal proceedings have been, even down to the visual of Julian being kept in a glass case like he's Hannibal Lecter or something. It's just been, I don't know, mind-blowing and disgusting. But, part of the reason we're here and part of the reason this film is important and part of the reason John does what he does every single day is that this support, this understanding, the protests that have gone on endlessly, they have an impact. And I think that's also what Stella Morris was trying to say, is that these trials and these hearings have become almost more about whether there is a groundswell of support and whether these lawmakers will feel ashamed enough that they finally release Julian Assange. It's not about the law. It's not about any reality behind any kind of charges in any way. So, in the film, you have several moments where you sound impressively poetic. You've got a way with words. I love when you say you're a builder. You were a builder by trade, and you build homes. And at one point, you say that a home is a stage for the theater of life, which I think is magical. So I'm going to get a little poetic here for a second. You said in the film that you've had a tough time through your life figuring out how to get to know people, but you also have a burning desire to give love. And I'm wondering if it feels a little bit like Julian found his way to give love to humankind by seeking justice through transparency.
Yeah, there's a certain, it's for a father, of course, we all say this about their children, but there's a certain particular seam of gold, which I call gold, which is an urge for truthfulness in Julian. He finds it, he doesn't tell fibs, so anyway, that's what I see, it's like a seam of gold that's in his character. I see that, and he brings that forth. Just commenting upon Stella's statement as well. Somebody asked me the other day, how many lawyers will it take to free Julian? I think, so far there's 100 lawyers worked on this matter. And the answer is none. Lawyers won't free Julian. Who will free Julian is civil society. Now, every European parliament, with the exception of Sweden, has an Assange group in it. One example, Greece, its parliament of 300, has 90. Every major head of state in the South America supports Julian, major and minor. Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, maybe on the 31st, Lula is a very strong supporter, Obrador in Mexico. The head of state in Australia says that Julian must be freed. Enough's enough. He's on a promise to do something. Every large civil society movement, the NGO, 26 of them, put a statement in the New York Times saying that Julian should be freed. So that's the circumstance that is burgeoning tide of support around the world amongst us, not them. And it's us who will force the change in the treatment of Julian and others like him. And it's us who will force the change. And we are so Lee runs, as you know, online journals. I don't know what you call this, contemporary things. Let's say a journal, an online journal. In the United Kingdom, the homogeneity of the old media, I'll call it old media, in supporting government is really noticeable, particularly over things like Ukraine. But the tremendous ferment in new media, the avenues where you can get information one after the other is just fabulous. So that's new media. So we, in turning away from government, old media towards new media, we have forced a change. And one element of that change is Julian, and another element of that change is Lee. And I think there's two others in the room who are doing the same thing. So we have forced that change. We haven't depended upon government to come along and say, oh, well, we'll have 1,000 new media outlets. We've brought it about through our discretion, our knowledge, our curiosity, and our lust for justice, to have the feeling of justice in the breast. I think it's passion rather than intellect, anyway.
You mentioned the world leaders. Have you or anybody connected to Julian had contact with the Biden administration?
When Biden administration first came in that was January 4th, before the January 6th invasion, or whatever it was, in the Capitol building in Washington, we had contact with the human rights section of the Biden administration. We wrote to them and they wrote back saying, wait a bit until after inauguration. And we thought, well, you know, when you get that sort of letter or that sort of instruction, it means that you'll sort of just wait, you know, that'll be it. So we left the United States and turned our attention to building support in the Congress rather than going straight to the administration.
You also mentioned the new media. Can you talk a little more about, are you amazed with just how little mainstream media has given support to Julian, even after all these years, even though it could very much mean the end of their own profession if Julian's not freed and is extradited?
Well, that came as a shock to me to understand that these media outlets embarked upon the most scurrilous, unscrupulous campaign of slander, calumnies and lies to Julian, who had made them all wealthy by his arrangements with them to publish simultaneously throughout the world. It was a shock. And the vicious hatred that emanated from government spokespeople in the United Kingdom and the United States saying he ought to be shooted or he ought to be murdered or give me a gun and I'll shoot. And these were people in responsible positions in institutions that I don't know, that are supposed to administer carefully lawfulness. And they get on TV, I think of one of the advisors to Harper, who at the time was the Prime Minister of Canada, saying that Julian should be shot, get a sniper to go and do it, or that Mrs. Clinton, as Secretary of State, saying, can't we just drone this guy? Shocked. It's very shocking.
Well, I want to wrap up this segment and move on to a Q&A, but I just want to say, these are incredibly tough times, but congrats on a very important and powerful film. And I guess I'll just conclude this portion by asking you what gives you strength to carry on this fight so tenaciously.
Lee, so just to do personal things, we've done this is the third one we've done together. And in every case, what gives you the strength and energy are the people who rock up, the people who roll up, you draw warmth and support. Well, meanwhile, I'm a human being. We draw warmth and support from each other. I must have hugged 10,000 people. Hugs aren't just something that passes you by, like sand on it. It gives strength. And so shaking hands and, these meetings, how can you say it? You can only refer to it really poetry. It's sort of magical and it wells up within the soul and it causes mothers have you said, to fight for their children, even to the extent of their demise. You'll see there's a terrible picture. It haunts me, but I have to say it. It's called the Madonna of Govlovka. Govlovka, as you know, is just up the road there in Ukraine. It's a town in eastern Ukraine. And there's a young woman dead. She must be 25, a very handsome young woman, with her baby, and her body, is trying to cover the baby. That's the answer. We just love our kids. And it gives you strength.
Well, thank you. All right, folks. I hope you enjoyed that interview with John Shipton, Julian Assange's father. But I'm going to continue this now with and this part will be live with one of the journalists who has done the best job at continuing to cover everything, every step of the way, everything that has happened to Julian Assange. He's been in the court virtually or otherwise at just about every moment of this. And so I thought he is a great way to fill out this hour and get some of the details of the play-by-play in Julian Assange's continued persecution. So he's the editor-in-chief of shadowproof.com, which you should all check out. Please welcome Kevin Gastolo. One second. There we go. Hey.
Hey, Lee. It's good to see you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it on this this special episode.
Yeah. No, and that was a very excellent interview. I assume you got to watch the film. I haven't been able to see it yet, but I've seen that it's been able to pick up some awards, which, they don't just hand out for the fact that you have a relevant campaign. Usually getting an award means that it's a good film in addition to being an urgent matter.
Yeah, it's a very powerful film. I don't know when. I hope they release it online soon, because it certainly should be seen by everybody. But it basically follows the life of Shipton and Stella Morris as they, because obviously there's very scant footage recently of Julian. They play some phone calls where you can hear his voice, but that's about it. And yeah, their fight is pretty endless and ongoing. I kind of was hoping you could kind of bring us up to date over the past few months. I feel like, I mean, part of it's because I don't understand the law. I don't necessarily understand British law. But then on top of that, it just always feels like every week they're like, oh, this hearing, that hearing, oh, it's been pushed back, this, that. And you kind of, at one moment you think he'll be extradited any minute. The next moment they say, oh, the appeals process will probably take 2 years. So I was wondering if you could break some of that down.
Yeah. So first, I want to mark this moment in time because it is a milestone. December was a milestone. So if you don't mind me just taking a very short diversion here, 5 years ago on December 21st, obviously we're at the end of the month, but I'm talking to you now. On that date, Julian Assange was secretly charged. And that was when the Justice Department first entered. And they did that with a magistrate judge because they were spying on Julian Assange and his lawyers in the Ecuador embassy. And they learned that the Ecuador government was going to try and help Julian Assange leave the embassy on Christmas so that he could come to Ecuador, and he was going to assume a diplomatic position with the Ecuador government so that he could have some protection in traveling from the embassy. And when they learned about that, not only did they secretly charge Julian Assange, they apparently confronted, according to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, they complained to Ecuadorian authorities, and then they issued the following day an international arrest warrant against Julian Assange. So this was 5 years ago, and if we
I was unaware that Ecuador was that close to having a plan to get him out.
Yeah, and one of the things which you'll be very interested in, given your background, is that at first, because of what was going on with Ecuador, already Moreno had been elected, I believe. So there was some issue because, I'll be very brash in my language. They kind of tried to rat fuck Julian Assange, the Ecuador government did, by trying to give him a post in Moscow, where he would be a diplomat there at their embassy. And he and his attorney said, well, no, we actually don't want to go to Russia. We'd like to go to Ecuador. That's where we would like to go. And so then, because there are records from this spy company, Undercover Global, watching and monitoring and collecting all these files on Julian Assange, then the media who got to see these records, like CNN and some of the other outlets, put out this idea that he wanted to go to Russia and be a diplomat there. And, they tried to lump him in with people like Edward Snowden, and like he wants to be there and he wants to turn against the US and live as a Russian. And so that's not true. They actually pushed back and got Ecuador to change it to a diplomatic passport for Ecuador, but that's still in the file. So anyways, to your question, okay, 4 Christmases later, here we are. Julian Assange has been in jail, which is not typical for somebody, especially someone who isn't accused. I mean, I don't have any problem putting it in these terms, even though I do not I'm not a supporter of like mass incarceration. I'm not generally a supporter of pretrial incarceration. But let's just say that if you are accused of terrorism, if you're an Al Qaeda leader who gets captured by the UK, you're going to be put in Belmarsh high security prison. That's where Julian Assange is being held. He's being held with people who are accused of terrorism offenses on battlefields abroad. And
what other level of criminal is in a glass cage in the courtroom?
Exactly. And the other thing that is, I learned about the UK system is somehow the US is much more fair and free when it comes to trying suspects, because we don't put them in glass cases in our courtrooms. Now you can be shackled in your ankles and on your wrists, but you get to sit with your lawyer. Julian Assange was not allowed to be anywhere near his attorney anytime I've ever seen him in a courtroom. He goes behind this glass box, as you're saying, just which I understand came from somewhere around, I think it actually predates 9/11, but obviously ramped up when they were turning their courtrooms into these, national security state complexes. They adopt this glass box that people could sit in. So he's here waiting, and you asked me, where does this all go next? We're waiting for this appeal, and the appeal is very important. The appeal is important because Julian Assange is going to have a first opportunity, if the High Court of Justice allows him to appeal, to argue in that courtroom that he has press freedom rights, because those were not upheld. Those were not recognized by Judge Vanessa Baretzer back in January 2021. We got that decision, and we got what looked like mercy. It looked like Julian Assange caught a break because the U.S. had lost. She declared that it was oppressive for health reasons to extradite Julian Assange to the United States. And we can't forget that was there, that was in the record, no matter how much the High Court tries to reverse that. And no matter how much the United States acts like, they've been vindicated and everything was true. She looked very closely at the evidence. She looked at where he would be imprisoned or detained in the United States. And she came to the conclusion that based on Julian Assange's health, he would be impacted in such a degree that he would try to kill himself in a U.S. prison or a U.S. detention center. I mean, she's using actual examples. She's using, a salacious and sensational example of Jeffrey Epstein, which, did he or did he not commit suicide? But then one that isn't controversial, Chelsea Manning, who tried to commit suicide, right? Tried to multiple times.
But and also with Epstein, either committed suicide, which proves the point, or he was killed, in which case it proves the point that these places are not a safe place for someone who has had even the CIA plan a hit against them.
Sure,
it's not safe for them. So either way, it proves the point.
Yeah. So she ruled that manner, but when you read her decision, she's upholding most everything that the U.S. government is saying about Julian Assange, which is highly disputed. She's dismissing the fact that there was this mass spying operation targeting him, his family, targeting his lawyers, targeting journalists who visited, targeting anyone who was a professor who came to speak with him. And just everybody who came to that embassy went through a checkpoint. They handed over their electronic devices, their bags. They left belongings at this checkpoint, where these people working under the auspices of security for the embassy rifled through your belongings and made copies and kept dossiers on the people who were coming to visit Julian Assange. And there is a parallel legal case, a criminal case from Assange and others in Spain against David Morales, the UC Global director, and I think one or two other people connected to UC Global. But then we have the more important, not that that's not important, but the more visible proceedings in the extradition case. And what we wait to find out in 2023 is, will Julian Assange get an appeal hearing before the High Court of Justice, where he already lost against the United States when they overturned the decision related to how he would be treated in U.S. prisons. And so yeah, I mean, he's in this legal limbo. When I have conversations with people like you, Lee, and others, it's always important to emphasize that punishment by process that is going on against Julian Assange, and how, it's important. And this is something that Juan Passarelli, who is a friend and colleague of Julian Assange, and he actually made a film separately from Ithaca himself, an independent film about WikiLeaks and the prosecution against Julian Assange. He made this point of, like, people always say it'll be unprecedented if Julian Assange is put on trial in the United States, but a precedent has already been set. Like there's already been an example established for what can be done to a person through the way that Julian Assange has been targeted. So yes, it's true that if he is put on trial on Espionage Act charges, it'll be an unprecedented case against a journalist, and I'll be there to cover every moment that I can of it. But we've already set a precedent, because the Justice Department has gotten away with indicting a publisher, and they haven't had to abandon their decision. They inherited it from the Trump administration, the Biden Justice Department, and they haven't backed away from it.
Right. Yeah, and even if they were to release him today, in many ways, they have proven their point that they will do anything to crush someone who reveals the truth about the U.S. empire and our war crimes. Although I always like to reiterate, he revealed crimes by many countries and big banks and many others. It was not just I'm going after the U.S. Situation with WikiLeaks, but the propaganda has led people to believe that. But I wanted to ask if you think this has any larger meaning. Just a few weeks ago, the New York Times, the Guardian, a couple other mainstream outlets, finally, too little, too late in a million ways, but finally put out an open letter saying the U.S. should drop the charges. And I'm wondering if you think that is any more than them covering their ass. Could this be that they, have people inside the Biden administration that basically said this is an okay thing to do because the U.S. might be soon, hopefully ending this?
The backstory for that is around the first few days of October. This was the same time that Stella Assange put together this human chain event to surround Parliament. And I actually came to DC for a solidarity rally and spoke, which was a great opportunity, like what John was talking about in the interview with him, the warmth of people, the way that everyone's able to come out and gather with each other. And that's true of many of the journalists and people who are there at these rallies, these activists, people who come out, who speak in favor of freeing Julian Assange. Holger Stark, who was the Washington, D.C. editor for Der Spiegel. Der Spiegel was one of the partners of New York Times, The Guardian, who WikiLeaks selected, who Julian Assange selected to receive the Afghanistan war logs and the Iraq war log documents. He put out this statement in early October around this time saying that it is now way overdue and it is way past time. And the 5 media organizations that directly benefited from publishing WikiLeaks' documents must come out and say clearly that they demand Julian Assange be freed from detention and that he no longer be charged with these Espionage Act crimes, etc. And so I think that maybe got kicked around a little bit behind the scenes. And then what came out was what we saw published by the New York Times. So I think that might actually be coverage of what the New York Times put out. And then each of the outlets listed or published their open letter demanding that the Justice Department end the prosecution of Assange. There are a few little things that we can say. One thing that was disappointing, very disappointing about the statement from the New York Times itself was that they didn't take a position on the computer charge. They were particularly focused on the Espionage Act offenses. And I think we know that that's the New York Times is probably the reason why they're not more strongly just saying drop all the charges. They're saying that they're opposed to the Espionage Act offenses.
Right.
But the other thing that is worth bringing up is that several days later, we don't usually get any hints of what's going on with the case or the attitude of the Biden White House. I think they're actually really embarrassed to say anything about this case because it just proves the lies that they tell about human rights and democracy on any given day. But we had from Eric Lichtblau for The Guardian. He left the New York Times. I don't know if you know who Eric Lichtblau is, but he's actually a very notable reporter because he worked with James Risen on the bombshell report from the New York Times that exposed the Bush administration's warrantless wiretapping program. And this was the article that was suppressed by the New York Times editors. And they delayed it until after George W. Bush was reelected. Okay, so he's left,
and they only published it because Risen said he was going to put out his book about it, and they knew they would be scooped.
Yeah. And so he gets his source at the Justice Department. I'm sure he's got more than a few. He gets someone to talk to him, and they say anonymously, Garland has made clear that he will follow the law wherever it leads, as he has in other politically charged cases. Now, you make a living parsing language. You're pretty good. You're pretty good with the word smithing and the empire speak that comes from the government. So, follow the law. I mean, I wrote a little bit about this for people who subscribe. To me, follow the law does sound right. Like all attorney generals should follow the law. There's nothing wrong with that. But what he's really saying is that we can't respond to this pressure on the Justice Department because if we do so, then we would be seen as a political organization who has made an inappropriate decision in the first place to charge Julian Assange with crimes. And, and, you know, I don't have to tell you, but I will say for the purposes of our discussion that the Justice Department, like most agencies in government, have always been political, have always been politicized. You know, it's as fanciful as the idea that all journalism is, or that journalism can be objective, or that documentaries can be objective. And it's along
what
those
you
lines.
choose to, the documentary is a good example. What you choose to point the camera out is the bias. So what you choose to claim is following the law, quote unquote, is the bias. So yeah, it's bullshit.
Yeah. And I mean, if they just followed the law, this is just my view, and we can debate this with me, but they just followed the law, then Donald Trump would have been indicted like 3 or 4 months ago. Because he actually lied about possessing classified documents. And that would have been just enough to get anybody who was a contractor for the NSA charged with a crime and marched off to detention. But we know that that's not how the justice system works. Anyways, stick to Julian Assange.
And on top of that, they wanted to impeach Trump. And they ended up impeaching him twice, but they had to find a way to impeach him that every U.S. president wasn't guilty of. So they didn't impeach him of war crimes or the emoluments clause or all of these things that he could have been caught on. But then you'd go, oh, well, every president has pretty much done this shit. He may be doing it more forthright. So they had to find, the first one was complete garbage and they had to find something to get him on that they could claim other presidents hadn't done. But anyway.
Yeah.
Someone asked a question in the chat, which I thought is a good thing to bring up, which I've mentioned many times, but doesn't get mentioned enough. How are we bringing charges against someone who's not a U.S. citizen and has never operated in the United States?
Yeah. Hell yeah to that person for bringing that up, because that is the point. It should be the point. In fact, it's probably what I should lead with. So I'm sorry that I'm not making that point. There are probably two things that I should lead with, although I suppose my interviews would get pretty boring if I always came with the same two things every time someone spoke to me. But I should probably lead with, he's not a U.S. citizen. Oh, in fact, actually, let me just shamelessly plug, I have a forthcoming book in February 2023. It's called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange, coming from Censored Press, our good friends over at Censored Press, Project Censored, and it's coming through 7 Stories Press. And I'm really excited to be able to share that. But, you know, one of the things
Project Censored does great work, and they've just started a press that puts out books. So that's cool.
Yes, and I'm one of their first 5 books, so that's kind of an honor. That's really a privilege to be able to work with them. So when I start the book, I begin with the words, Julian Assange is a journalist. And I very clearly make that something that needs to be stated definitively. And then I'll lead into the thing about he's not a U.S. citizen, so how is he being charged? But I start there because, unfortunately, even the best press freedom organizations have been timid and wishy-washy about whether he's a journalist or not. The Committee to Protect Journalists puts out good statements on Julian Assange and why the case should be dropped, but they refuse to include him in their annual jailed journalists index every single year.
Wow.
And so, and I've challenged them. I didn't get around to it this year, but there's still time. There's still 48 hours left. So 36 hours as we're doing this interview. There's time for me to get on CPJ, and I will. So you have to make that point. I think you can't concede that so a lot of people say, well, the supporters will say, in more like established press freedom organizations, they'll say, well, you know, it really doesn't matter if he's a journalist or not. He performed journalism. And so we should defend what he did because everything he did was the act of publishing and that should be protected. Okay, but now you've allowed the US government to get away with denying him this identity of being a journalist. You've taken away this thing that is a defense, because if he can claim to be a journalist, then you don't have to argue with anybody about what he's going through. It would all be accepted that this should have ended years and years ago, that this should never have happened in the first place. But if you say, oh, he's not a journalist, then it becomes this gray area and you're just, you know, it's just field for intellectual masturbation with scholars and former security agents over like, ooh, wow, isn't this interesting about where this is all headed and how this has gone? And you can have bullshit Hayden Center events with fraud whistleblower attorneys and crackpot FBI agents that you never knew before, who have like JD Salinger names like Holden Triplet.
Not only is he a journalist, but he's also the most accurate journalist who's ever lived, considering nothing WikiLeaks ever published was false.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So then when you establish he's a journalist, you have to explore that question of why is he being prosecuted if he isn't a citizen? How is it that the Espionage Act, which is a U.S. domestic law, can be enforced against other people around the world? And that is incredibly dangerous in my mind, that the U.S. government thinks its laws can be applied to people who do not live in the United States. You know, and on that note, I think that's why and how, we can have such a strong coalition of people globally who are opposed to this. They've been growing the coalition in Latin America. I mean, they've even got some shift in politics in Australia. I don't know how much you got from any of your recent conversations with John, but there have been some positive developments with Australia. The only problem is, when all is said and done, they're still a Five Eyes country, and they're going to be very careful about how much they piss off the security state. So
yeah, they have a more left-wing prime minister now who has said that I don't know if he said he would bring Assange home or he'll look into it, or there's some positive that he believes Assange should come back to Australia. But there's been no movement that I've seen on that. So it's just words until it's not.
So if you can prosecute somebody who isn't a U.S. citizen under the Espionage Act, then what you're doing is you're creating this standard, because the U.S. holds itself out as that beacon on the hill, right? And so now you're sending a message to, in my mind, to any regional power that has any authority in any area and any ability to extradite people, that they can claim that their state secrets have been compromised, and they can go after people and extradite them. I mean, I'm thinking of like Israel, I'm thinking of Turkey, I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia. When Bolsonaro was running Brazil, I was thinking that like that could be a country maybe that could try to strong arm and get journalists and say they were protecting their state secrets. What we saw, something similar, like they were considering trying to bring something against Glenn Greenwald in Brazil that had some hallmarks of Assange prosecution. Or it's good that now Lula is in power, or will be in power, and supports. But of course, the CIA is always working behind the scenes in Latin America, and at any moment, those people could be removed from power, and then we're back to, what could any of these regional powers do? So we're seeing this where people could, any correspondents have to be careful about what they publish, because maybe they could be snatched up and arrested and treated like Julian Assange, because that government is going to claim that they want to protect their state secrets, just like the U.S. government is saying they must protect state secrets through prosecutions.
And this took another leap forward in Ukraine, declaring a list of quote unquote information terrorists, which was the committee that put out that list, which included a candidate for Senate, as well as Rand Paul and Roger Waters and some other journalists. The committee that put that together in Ukraine is partially funded by the U.S. and had a State Department person in the audience as that was being announced. And they said they were looking into bringing war crimes charges against senators and journalists. I mean, and the U.S. is essentially endorsing this.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess I'm making a kind of slippery slope argument, but we're already down that slope. Like we're already headed feet first into this gulch that, and everyone's being sucked into it. And I just think that, like, obviously everything we've seen proves that the Biden White House is telling a bunch of lies when they come out and make these proclamations. And they'll, we never hesitate, at least, and by we, I guess the U.S. officials that run this country never hesitate to lecture other countries on how they should promote democracy, on how they should uphold human rights, on what press freedom is. Fortunately, as they try to lecture Latin American countries, particularly, it's become a lot harder, because like half of Latin America is now a coalition that is against U.S. meddling in their countries, and including what they're seeing happen to Peru. And so it's like, but this was always an example that was put forward. It was one that, like, I think Edward Snowden recognized, especially with what the U.S. was able to do to trap him in Russia, that he understood. And they even like have brought him into the case, because people should remember that they're criminalizing Julian Assange for providing source protection to Edward Snowden, for saying that, like, we're going to do what the Guardian wouldn't do. The Guardian wouldn't help Edward Snowden get out of Hong Kong. They send Sarah Harrison at WikiLeaks to Hong Kong to be with him when he travels to Moscow. And then that's going to go on to Ecuador and until his passport was revoked. And that's something that none of the organizations that publish files from Snowden, including The Intercept, would have been willing to do in order to support Snowden.
Yeah. Well, I'll wrap up with this, a little bit more personal of a question. You have been so good on the Assange story. What does it mean to you, and how did you find yourself making this your beat?
So this was something that I was really intrigued by back in 2010 when I I graduated film school. But I had
Oh, I
been
didn't know.
doing a lot of work writing about protests against the Iraq War, and there were demos here in the city of Chicago, and I was following Democratic Party politics, which is lame and uninteresting at this point. And so I was really taken by they're publishing these files that are coming from WikiLeaks, and I got an internship at The Nation, and I got to work with Greg Mitchell, who was doing this live blog on WikiLeaks. So I just ran and went headfirst into it, covering the cables every day. And these diplomatic cables were amazing. Like people, like it was such a time. I mean, I really feel like it was a privilege to be alive between November and May 2011 when these were coming out, and the whole US government was on edge, concerned about what was going to be revealed next that they were doing that they couldn't defend in public.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went, just to wrap up quickly, I went to cover the court martial of Chelsea Manning. I got to work for a little blog called Firedog Lake. I had my boss, Jane Hampshire, who was kind of titan in progressive media, or the blogosphere, the progressive blogosphere at that time. We were way better than fucking Daily Kos. And then after all of that, I just stuck with it. And I figured that this was something that I needed to follow until its end. And I mean, so long as the US government is coming for these people, I just figure I can't be done with the story. And because I'm tired of it, I have to follow it until the US government gets tired of going after. Well, first it was Chelsea Manning, but then she got clemency. And so I was able to kind of move away from that. But then I came back to it because she was put in jail for a year because she wouldn't snitch on Julian Assange and give them something to use to prosecute him.
Not just snitch, but lie.
Yeah. Well, they wanted her to change her statement that she gave in court about the timeline.
Yeah.
Which is enough for another show. Have me on another show when my book comes out. We'll talk about the conspiracy theory that's been made up around Julian Assange. Which, you know, the problem with their theory is everything she said is completely different from what prosecutors are trying to say happened with Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. But yeah, then I do that. And I figure that all these whistleblower stories who are connected, like John Kiriakou, Edward Snowden, Thomas Drake, all of these people in the Espionage Act overall, that needs to be followed. And then Julian Assange gets indicted, and then I'm just pulled back into it. And I'm going to stick with Julian Assange until it's over, because I committed myself back in 2010. Everything that I've done to get here was because I was publishing and writing about WikiLeaks and covering Chelsea Manning. And so I owe all of these people who have done all of this important work to see it to its bitter end, which, you know, on one hand, I really hope is Julian Assange gets to walk free and rejoin his family. But in our darkest moments, we fear that the end could mean that we get that news headline one day that Julian Assange has been found dead in his cell at Belmarsh. And that's the way it ends. And in fact, the Joe Biden administration never has to worry about a show trial that's going to be a circus in Alexandria, Virginia. And they get to just wash their hands clean of this because he's now gone. But I know you have to wrap. I know we have to end, but I did want to point out that Vivienne Westwood just died, who was a huge supporter, a very big supporter of Julian Assange in the UK. And I don't know if you saw this, but this was remarkable to me because Stella Assange put out a statement from Julian. And I've been following this really closely. I don't remember the last time that we had words from Julian Assange about anyone. So that tells you how much Vivienne mattered. But he said, Vivienne was a dame and a pillar of the anti-establishment, bold, creative, thoughtful, and a good friend, the best of Britain. She will be missed terribly by me and many others. So, you know, I can't tell you how powerful it is, even though those are just like the most routine boilerplate, rest in peace kind of a statement from Julian. I don't know. It really moves me to hear words from Julian right now. Cause like he can't speak about anything. He hasn't spoken about anything.
Yeah. Well said. And everything you said is incredibly important. And thank you again for your tenacious reporting. And remind everybody where they can grab your book.
Yeah, so I mean, there's going to be a pre-order link that'll be going around, but you can find it on all the most evil corporate websites that I won't name. But if you go to, let's see, I mean, a good way is just go to bookshop.org and type in "guilty of journalism: the political case against Julian Assange." There should be a pre-order link that appears in January. But we'll have it going around. I'll make sure that people who follow me, and I think a lot of the people who listen to your show also have seen my Assange work. I just have a feeling that we're kind of like in the same circle and there's a little bit of overlap. But then for the regular updates on the Assange case, that's at the Shadowproof newsletter, the dissenter.org. And it's a free newsletter, even with a premium option. But the free newsletter, I always send out the updates on Assange to everyone so people can remain engaged and know what the mainstream media doesn't tell you or what the corporate media doesn't tell you. Because, you know, the important point is it's not that the corporate media ignores the big developments in Assange's case. And in fact, the editor-in-chiefs are on record being opposed to the charges from the very beginning. But what's bad about them is that they do not cover every single development so you can follow the progression and know where this is going. And that's why I have to do these interviews with people like Lee or Rania Khalek, where they ask me, what is happening right now? We don't even know. And that's because the people with resources aren't telling you.
Yeah, totally. All right. Thanks again, Kevin. I really appreciate your time and I hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah. Happy New Year. Talk to you later.
Happy New Year. Thanks everybody for being a part of this. These interviews, which I, just started a couple of months ago, they are completely funded by you. They only keep going with your help. So I hope you will go over to patreon.com/behind the headlines and become a member at whatever level works for you. Behind the Headlines is Mint Press's video platform. So this is a Mint Press project. If you are, looking for a great news site and you haven't heard of them, you should definitely be checking out Mint Press News. They're incredible. And thanks for following all my stuff at leecamp.net. Happy New Year to everybody. I have interviews coming up next week with, let's see, who is next week? God damn it. I know it's a good one too. Anyway, interview coming up next week. And then the week after that, I believe, is Stella Morris, actually, Julian Assange's wife. Should be coming up soon. Also, I talked to Katie Halper, co-host of Useful Idiots, yesterday. If you want to see that one and all my interviews, Scott Ritter, Chris Hedges, Stephen Donziger, Richard Wolf. If you want to see all of these, go to youtube.com/behind the headlines, and they're all there. Click subscribe because, there's no guarantee that this interview show that I do for you guys will be able to continue. So again, it's 100% funded by you and you make it possible to continue. So I'll see you soon and Happy New Year and keep fighting.